So normative thinking runs through a variety of fields. Normative ethics, obviously, I've already talked about that. How ought one act? There's a branch of economics that's called normative economics that is focused on what ought the economy be like. And you can then extend that to say, well, what ought it be like to support what priorities? What ought it be like to support national security? What ought it be like to promote social well-being? So that's the branch of economics that is about ought. Jurisprudence, we have a legal system, we have legal reasoning, and jurisprudence is that area of study in the law that asks, well, what is the law? But let's go beyond that and ask, what should it be and why? And then political philosophy. Political science is divided generally into three areas. Political philosophy, which is what should our political systems be like to enhance human flourishing. Political science is descriptive, what are they like? And policy analysis is, now that it's implemented, what's the effect? Okay? But you see how norms run across a variety of fields. And there's one more big idea that I need to just briefly touch on, and that's this idea of structuration. This is the idea of Anthony Giddens. This idea was put forward in a book he published in 1984 called The Constitution of Society. Giddens is still a professor. He's at the London School of Economics. And the big idea here, which turned some of social science on its head, and so that influenced economics, and that influenced policy and political philosophy, law. The big idea that Giddens put forward with structuration is that social decisions are not just a dichotomy. Almost all approaches up to this idea of structuration either looked at agents, how do people make decisions, what drives them, what motivates them, or it looked at structures, institutions. And by institutions, we mean large social structures such as markets, government, civil society, cultures, norms embedded in those cultures. So the thinking up to Giddens had been to focus on either one or the other. And Giddens came along and he said, wait, there's a co-generational relationship here. Structures, markets, norms, civil society, they influence how people act, but people constitute structures, markets, and norms. And because people constitute them, they can transform them. So there's a co-adaptive, complex relationship, and what he's after is the things that transcend time and space. So that's what you're looking for when you take a structurational approach to studying something. And I'm trying to take this paradigm and look at public policy and information assurance and security. So structuration is important. So to recap that brief tour of multidisciplinary perspectives, I believe norms are an integral part of human life. Norms will vary greatly by people, by cultures. They're conveyed and enacted through multiple social structures, and I've already mentioned a few of those large social structures. These structures shape norms, and generative action is not only possible but constantly underway, so that people are in turn reciprocally shaping the structures. And I believe that any field that finds itself confronted with questions of ought and should which includes information assurance and security in my definition, has to consider norm-maintaining structures as well as shifts in social structure and shifts in those norms. And so when I think of information assurance and security, I view it like this. And I'm probably leaving out some big areas. But I think it's partly about technology. I think it's partly about policy. I think it's partly about culture. I think it's partly about economics. And when I think about the macro ethical issues confronting us, for example, privacy, ownership, I think it lies at the intersection of these co-constitutive relationships that are, in fact, changing. And these are a lot of questions that one could ask. And they're huge questions, right? If you think of information assurance and security in that diagram that I just had up, you could ask things like, well, what is the nature of the relationships among technology, policy, economics, and culture in information assurance and security? How does culture affect what policy gets implemented, and how does that affect the state of assurance and security? How does economics influence what technology gets developed? And how does that influence the state of assurance and security? If you look at policies, public policies, I don't mean organizational policies, I mean public policies. If you look at the public policies that we have, why do we have the ones we have? And we're going to get into some of them in just a little bit. Why do we have those and not some others? Why have certain issues seen the light of day on the legislative agenda while others have not? Why, given all of the challenges that we are currently having with file sharing and ownership rights to movies, to music, why do we continue to have that policy? Is that the best policy position in 2009? Did anybody go to Robert McLaughlin's talk last night? Scientific Reasoning and the Closing of the American Mind? I didn't either, but it was related to this. So a lot of the position that we have comes out of our long history of property rights in the United States. And so we've tried to extend all of that to intellectual property. And sometimes the extension works and sometimes it falls a bit short. How do economic constituencies interact with regard to information assurance and security? And I'm sure you can understand that these are not just U.S.-centric questions. You know, we live in a global environment. You know, how do our policies, how does our economic approach to running our country conflict internationally? Gosh, are our existing policies meeting our well-being needs? To what extent? You know, these are huge, huge questions. And I'm sure that if we had time, we could brainstorm a lot more, you know, a lot more and questions at the bottom of this. And it's almost overwhelming when you start getting those big questions out in front of you. It's almost overwhelming. So, you know, one always has to start someplace. And so you pull it back in and find a starting place that you think, if I could gain some insight here, then perhaps I could get up on top of the horizon and see a little further that would help me provide further insight into some of those other questions. So my starting point is data breach. Data breach disclosure, I already mentioned that. Why this starting point? Well, we do have a spate of data breach disclosure laws enacted in the last 6 years in our country. There's some controversy over them. over whether they're the right laws or not.